afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar entitled A Conversation on the RIN and Strategies to Standardize eRulemaking. My name is David Grant-Hill, and I will serve as the moderator for today's presentation. Our presenters today will be Kristen Tenswan and Brian Crow, who are part of the eRulemaking Project Management Office. Kristen is a project manager with the eRulemaking program. She has worked with the eRulemaking team since 2003, serving as communications manager prior to managing the federal docket management system. Before joining eRulemaking, Kristen spent 10 years as a regulatory analyst supporting regulatory compliance and development efforts with a focus on solid and hazardous and the toxics release inventory for EPA. Brian joined the eRulemaking program in 2010 as a program analyst. Prior to joining the eRulemaking program, he spent 5 years as a biologist with the U.S. EPA Office of Pesticide Programs Registration Division and served as a rule writer on various federal regulatory actions. Before we begin the webinar, I would like to mention some housekeeping items for today's presentation. If you have any questions, use the chat feature located at the bottom right-hand side of the screen and send a message to our moderating team. They will collect the questions for the question and answer session at the end of the presentation. If we are unable to answer any specific questions today, we will include additional information related to these questions on a frequently asked questions document that will be posted to the Exchange website. If you experience any technical difficulties during the presentation, please chat with the moderating team for assistance. Additionally, an electronic copy of this webinar presentation will be available on the Exchange website. And now, here's Kristen.
Thank you, David. We're on slide 3. Why are we here today? On behalf of the eRulemaking program, I'd like to thank everyone for participating in today's webinar. Our goal today is to create awareness and encourage discussion within the eRulemaking community on our plans to use the Regulation Identifier Number, commonly referred to in the federal regulatory community as the RIN. These plans will use the RIN as a mechanism to increase transparency and improve public participation in the rulemaking process by improving the way the public can find and track a particular action. Some of the key points we will discuss today about the RIN are: what is a RIN? How can the RIN increase transparency in the rulemaking process? How can the RIN improve public participation in the eRulemaking process? How can the RIN make it easier to find and track actions? How do we plan to help agencies use the RIN? And what changes can we make to regulations.gov to leverage the RIN? We welcome and encourage your feedback and suggestions on our approach for the use of the RIN. You may send questions throughout the webinar using the chat tool, and we'll take time at the end of the webinar for a question and answer session. On to slide 4, an overview of the eRulemaking program. Established back in 2002, the eRulemaking program is a federal-wide e-government initiative committed to increasing access to and participation in the federal rulemaking process. The Environmental Protection Agency serves as the managing partner of the eRulemaking program. EPA established a program management office to oversee the system operation and development based on collaboration with all of our agency partners. To promote more efficient and effective rulemaking through public involvement, we launched the regulations.gov website in 2003. In addition to providing the public with online access to thousands of regulations issued by federal agencies each year, for the first time, the public could submit their comments through this new website and help shape the rules and regulations that impact their lives all in one place. We also manage the Federal Docket Management System, also affectionately known as the FDMS. This system is used by our partner agencies to make their regulatory information available to the public on regulations.gov. Through regulations.gov, we continue to provide the public easy one-stop shopping to this information. And with each new release of our site, we remain committed to providing the public improved access to agency regulations. Now on slide 5, a little bit about the best practices document. During the last 6 months, we at the eRulemaking program have worked closely with our partner federal agencies to develop a best practices document. This document will ultimately help our partner agencies improve their electronic dockets found on regulations.gov. We released an initial draft of this document in November 2010, and it's available for download from the Exchange website at the URL noted on the slide. The document introduces a number of best practices for federal agencies that support 3 strategic goals. The first strategic goal is to increase public access to the federal regulatory content on regulations.gov. The second strategic goal is to build a common taxonomy and establish protocols for managing dockets and regulatory documents. And the third strategic goal is to compile comprehensive electronic and increase agency efficiency within the FDMS. There are a number of best practices that are intended as a guide for agencies to help increase openness in the federal regulatory process and drive changes to regulations.gov and FDMS. We are making many of these changes by relying on the RIN, which at this time Bryant will further discuss.
We are on slide 6. Thank you, Kristen. We will start our discussion by answering the question, what exactly is the regulation identifier number? A RIN is an alphanumeric identifier used to uniquely identify a regulatory action. It enables the public to track the life cycle of a desired regulatory action as it advances through the federal rulemaking process. The RIN is assigned by the Office of Management and Budget for each regulatory action under their review. All RINs consist of a unique 4-digit agency code followed by a 4-character alphanumeric code. Since RINs are exclusively used to identify rulemaking actions, they enable the public to determine whether an action is either rulemaking or non-rulemaking when using related federal regulatory information systems and publications. And as we will discuss today, the RIN can also serve as a tool to improve the regulatory process.
Moving on to slide 7, where can you find the RIN? The RIN is first available to the public on reginfo.gov, which provides a list of the regulatory actions that are currently under review by the Office of Management and Budget. The Unified Agenda of Federal Regulatory and Deregulatory Actions, published semi-annually, also contains the RIN assigned to each agency action. The Unified Agenda can be found on both reginfo.gov and regulations.gov. The RIN may also be found for many documents in the official Federal Register document that publishes that particular agency action. And agencies may also include the RIN in the docket and document details of a particular action on regulations.gov. And just a quick note, for those that are new to eRulemaking, a docket is a term you will hear used frequently throughout this presentation. A docket is simply a place on regulations.gov and FDMS where documents and other information are stored for rulemaking or other action.
Now on slide 8, how is the RIN used today? As you can see, the RIN is widely used as an identifier for regulatory actions. The RIN is assigned to all regulatory actions in a unified agenda. In the fall 2010 Unified Agenda alone, the RIN was included for all 4,225 regulatory actions. In FDMS, the RIN is included for over 9,000 rulemaking dockets. But as you can also see, there are some inconsistencies with how the RIN is used in FDMS. For instance, the RIN is not required and the format is not currently enforced. The RIN is also currently used for both rulemaking and non-rulemaking dockets. By working with agencies to eliminate these inconsistencies and encourage the use of the RIN on all of their rulemaking dockets, we can improve data quality. This will increase the value of the RIN as a tool to make regulatory information easier to find and understand. We can then make enhancements to regulations.gov to better inform the public about the regulatory process, as well as use the RIN to help with the effort to standardize regulatory information.
Moving on to slide 9, how will the RIN help you find regulatory information? The RIN can be used today to search for regulatory actions on regulations.gov. However, the RIN may not always return the most comprehensive results, since not all rulemaking dockets may be assigned this identifying number. If information, like documents that support the rulemaking, are not contained in one consolidated docket, users may not find this supporting data when searching by a RIN. But once the RIN is used consistently and assigned by agencies to all rulemaking dockets, it will be easier for the public to find an agency's particular regulatory action and any related information on regulations.gov. Let me give you an example. I'm on a listserv to receive notifications from the Consumer Product Safety Commission. I receive an email from them about a new limit on a lead content in children's toys. I could then go to regulations.gov and use the RIN that I received in the email to search for that lead rule. My search would return all of the relevant information for that action, and I would be able to read the proposed rule, final rule, and supporting and related materials. As you can see, the RIN will allow us to compile and consolidate all of the information on a particular action and present this information to the public in one place on regulations.gov. Although knowing the RIN simplifies the process of finding related materials, the public could still search for a regulatory action by agency. For example, the Consumer Product Safety Commission. Because the RIN serves as a unifier, you would still find all information related to the regulatory action.
Now on slide 10, so how will the RIN help you understand regulatory information? We have discussed how the RIN is a unique identifier and how the RIN can help users find information on regulations.gov. We have also found that it can be a unifier of regulatory information across related federal regulatory systems, allowing for not only the sharing of vital data, but with the potential to increase the amount of data that is available to the public. This, in turn, leads to increased transparency and a better understanding of the regulatory process. That is, the regulatory information that you find on these related sites will be up to date and consistent. An update of a regulatory action in one system will be reflected on regulations.gov. Additionally, all of the regulatory actions related Federal Register documents will share the same RIN. This presents the document as a series of unified materials issued by the originating agency over the life cycle of the regulatory action. In order for the RIN to function as a unifier, the FDMS best practices must be followed by agencies to ensure that data quality standards are adequate enough to facilitate such enhancements. Moving on to slide 11. How will the RIN help you understand regulatory information? One such enhancement we would like to further discuss is the display of a regulatory timeline on regulations.gov. This timeline will leverage the stages of rulemaking that are used today in the Unified Agenda and on reginfo.gov. These stages are pre-rule, proposed rule, final rule, long-term action, and completed action. The timeline will show the date the action entered each stage of rulemaking, allowing the public to view all of the materials that were created during each stage and be consistent across all federal regulatory systems. Once we have this timeline in place, we can explore even more features to provide more information to the public for a rulemaking. By explaining the full life cycle of a regulatory action, the public can see each step the agency took and better understand their impact on the development of the action. This transparency will help us meet the goal of increasing public participation in the regulatory process.
Moving on to slide 12, we would like to conclude this part of today's webinar by summarizing some of the changes we are making to regulations.gov and FDMS. We'll also mention some additional ways you can participate in this ongoing discussion. Some changes we are making to regulations.gov include displaying the RIN to the public for all rulemaking dockets and documents, and displaying a regulatory timeline to help the public track an action through its entire life cycle. As Bryant just mentioned, this timeline will highlight the current stage of the rulemaking, the date a docket entered the stages of the rulemaking, and all of the materials that were created during each stage. Changes we are making to FDMS include enhancements to make it easier for agencies to include the RIN on all rulemaking dockets and documents. Some of these changes include prompts for users to enter the RIN, tools for users to look up RINs that are available for their agency, and ways to populate all of the documents in a docket with the appropriate RIN. We will also enforce the correct format of the RIN and automatically display the RIN to the public on regulations.gov. We are also working with the Regulatory Information Service Center at GSA and the Office of the Federal Register to improve interfaces between reginfo.gov, federalregister.gov, and FDMS and regulations.gov. The benefits of improving the interfaces between these systems include an increase in the exchange of data across the system, the ability to provide timely information to the public earlier in the rulemaking process, promoting consistency between the systems, and reducing burden on agency users by eliminating redundant data entry and automating some tasks where possible. Moving on to slide 14, how else can you participate? We'd like for you to stay involved by going to the Exchange website and joining a discussion. The online discussion will be open for at least 2 months and maybe even longer. You can learn more by reading the best practices document and continue to send us your questions on the RIN and best practices. You can send us your suggestions on other ways to improve the regulatory process. Both Bryant and I welcome your emails, and our email information is on the last slide of this presentation. We will be holding additional webinars throughout the rest of the year. Our next webinar is planned for later this spring. So check the Exchange site for upcoming details.
Thank you, Kristen. Brian? We will now transition to the question and answer period of today's webinar. Several of our attendees today sent us questions at the time of registration, and others have been sending us questions via chat during the presentation. We have selected a few of these questions to address with you today. All of the questions and answers we discuss now, as well as those we are unable to answer today, will be compiled and posted to the Exchange website. We will now take our first question. Our first question is, what is a docket?
This is Kristen. As I mentioned before, we use the term docket or docket folder on regulations.gov, which is a collection of documents related to a rulemaking or other non-rulemaking actions. The docket folder can contain the Federal Register document, notices and rules, material specifically referenced in those documents, public comments, application, petitions, or adjudication documents, and other materials used by decision makers.
Thank you, Kristen. Our next question is, I know you've explained to me a little bit about the RIN, but could you explain to me one more time, what is the RIN?
Certainly. The RIN stands for Regulation Identifier Number. It's a code assigned to regulatory actions that are undergoing review by the Office of Management and Budget. All RINs consist of this unique four-digit agency code, followed by a four-character alphanumeric code. So roughly, or more or less, it's four numbers, a dash, two letters, and two numbers.
Thanks, Brian. Our next question is, do only rulemakings have RINs assigned to them?
In general, rulemaking actions are assigned to RIN. We have been working with our partner agencies to better understand their rulemaking and non-rulemaking processes. We found that there are indeed circumstances when a non-rulemaking action will be assigned to RIN, primarily because that action is undergoing OMB review and the RIN is the tracking number of sorts for this review process. We will make sure that any changes made to FDMS will not burden or disrupt these unique scenarios at our partner agencies.
Thank you, Brian. And we appear to have a follow-up question from our audience today that we received via IM. Why do you think the RIN is going to be an effective search tool for the public to utilize in locating a docket? I am a law librarian and have never had a professor or student ask for a docket by number.
Well, to talk here, and this is a very, very good question, of course. We think that it would be especially useful in this way if we promote the RIN beginning with regulations.gov and having webinars such as this one where we promote the use of the RIN and in order to make sure that the public has a clear understanding of its value. You are a law librarian by profession. You also know the importance of the ISBN number as it relates to specific books. That ISBN refers directly to one particular book. And in this particular case, we're promoting the RIN because we find that it's quite relevant in a similar way. Because the RIN actually has what we're promoting in the best practices, a one-to-one relationship between the RIN and a docket, so that one could go to regulations.gov and enter the RIN in the search field and actually directly find that rulemaking action of interest, just as one would go to a typical online bookstore and search by a RIN to locate a book.
Thanks, Brian. We have another RIN question that has just come in today. Is it possible that once the RIN is entered into a docket, it defaults to all documents added to the docket?
That is correct. We are currently working out the condition, and this does require a bit more research, but as it's implemented in our system, the idea is to actually allow the RIN to essentially be added. Once documents are added to a docket, the documents will essentially inherit or receive the RIN that's associated with that docket. So it will be automatically assigned, sort of an auto-population of the RIN on each document that is associated with a specific rulemaking docket.
And that will reduce the burden. The intent is, to reduce the burden on the agency user, and make it easier for them, to include the RIN on those relevant documents.
Great. Thanks, Kristen. Brian? More questions on the RIN. Do only rulemakings have RINs assigned to them?
Currently, as we noted in our discussion, that until these recent best practices, there has been no sort of enforcement or necessarily, or let's say guidance provided to certain agency users in terms of how to actually use the RIN. So in that way, it's actually not used in a consistent way. So the idea here is to actually allow the RIN to be associated with rulemaking dockets. This is definitely something that we're promoting in the best practices. However, we are aware of some agencies' very specific practices, rulemaking practices, that actually may require some sort of exceptions. So again, it is something that we're currently considering in terms of how to actually implement it in a very in a very useful way.
Thanks, Brian. Our next question is, I use regulations.gov a lot, and there are a few agencies who are not putting additional background information in their rulemaking dockets on the site. What is the eRulemaking program doing to improve this?
Well, actually, one of our strategic goals in the best practices document is to compile comprehensive electronic dockets on regulations.gov. We do acknowledge that some of the dockets on regulations.gov do not contain the background documents that support a proposed action. Therefore, we included some agency best practices that will meet our goal to ensure transparency throughout the agency's decision-making process. In fact, there's a recent executive order improving regulation and regulatory review that directs agencies to include such background documents like relevant scientific and technical findings during the rulemaking process. And so we will be closely working with our partner agencies to assist them in efforts to upload all of the relevant documents into the docket. The system has, certain capabilities, such as a bulk import feature, that will help agencies upload multiple sets of documents into the system.
Thank you, Kristen. We now move on to our next question. The rulemaking lifecycle often includes a pre-rule stage, as indicated in the Unified Agenda. Right now on regulations.gov, you can only find documents beginning with the proposed rule published in the Federal Register. Are pre-rule documents also going to be accessible on regulations.gov?
We're currently working with agencies to determine how best to implement the rulemaking timeline feature, which would be very helpful with beginning to categorize and arrange the related or relevant regulatory materials for a rulemaking action in such a way that would allow the pre-rule related materials to be clearly visible and accessible to the public directly from regulations.gov.
Thanks, Brian. Our next question is, when will we be able to see the regulatory timeline feature on regulations.gov?
We're currently analyzing our data sources for the timeline feature, which will include data from a number of other federal regulatory information systems, such as reginfo.gov, also the Unified Agenda Report, as well as the Federal Register. And we're trying to figure out the best ways to incorporate this data into FDMS, which is the back end of regulations.gov. And we hope to plan to have this feature available on regulations.gov as early as fall 2011.
Thanks, Brian. Our next question, what are the current efforts to standardize the format of Federal Register preambles?
That's a good question that we often hear from agencies. Actually, the Office of Federal Register is the primary organization responsible for the publication of the Federal Register documents. But we at eRulemaking are working closely with the Office of Federal Register as well as the Government Printing Office to ensure the interface between our systems, regulations.gov, fdsys.gov, and federalregister.gov are maximized.
Great. Thanks, Kristen. A good follow-up to that question for agencies, or what are you asking the agencies to do as their next plan of action?
In the best practices document, we offer, several suggestions and ways to help agencies increase the use of RIN and make it easier for them to include it on their regulatory dockets and documents. We did talk today about some changes that we'll be making to the system. But, basically, as I said before, we're going to be working with agencies starting from now, having some webinars specifically for agencies, showing them some of these best practices, what they can start doing now, and especially when we, with the upcoming releases of FDMS in May, that will start incorporating some of these features. And so we'll definitely be working with them throughout the rest of the year.
Great. Thanks, Kristen. Our next question is, how is the eRulemaking program working towards encouraging public participation, and in particular the segment of the population who may not have easy access to the Internet or are not otherwise, quote-unquote, plugged in, and even those who may be apprehensive at participating in government at all?
That's a really good question. One of our biggest challenges at eRulemaking is, in general, reaching out to the public and encouraging public participation in the regulatory process. The biggest thing is, trying to explain the actual regulatory process. It's not an easy thing to understand. And so, challenge is explaining to them in ways that the public can understand and is meaningful. In fact, that was actually the inspiration for our video contest that we sponsored last year. It's called Rulemaking Matters. We wanted to ask the public how rulemaking is important to them and to see how they can explain and describe why it's important to participate in the process. We actually have a YouTube channel, and you can go and see the winning video. It's at youtube.com/user, USER/regulationsgov, and that's no dot in between the .gov. We are always continuing to look for ways to improve outreach to the public, and I think the best way to do this, plugged in or not, is just to work with our stakeholder community, our partner agencies, the public interest organizations, and our academic groups.
Okay, a few more questions here today. Is there any thought being given to the idea of citizens being no specific rulemakings based on personal profiles?
I'm so glad you asked that question. One of the upcoming features that we are planning for regulations.gov is actually to introduce My Regulation account, which is quite similar to those accounts one might find on the Library of Congress site, MyLOC. It will work in a similar manner. Point out another popular government site that uses the similar profile features for those that may not be as familiar with what's being asked here. The USA Jobs, which allows one to customize their actual job searches within the federal government according to a certain criteria that they actually create themselves. So again, sort of taking these examples, we began to develop requirements for My Regulations account to be available to the public, and it will give public users the ability to sign in to the site and create these accounts, which they can actually establish their own criteria, and also which could then be used to customize notifications, create saved searches based on different rules of interest and criteria, such as their favorite agencies, industry sectors, and so forth. this is something that we're working towards developing to make rules more accessible, and not just rules, but regulatory actions altogether more accessible to the public.
That's great, Brian. I look forward to signing up for myself to that one day. Thank you. A couple more questions here. Are agencies going to be required to include the RIN on regulatory dockets?
Ideally, we would like to require agencies to include the RIN. However, we do need additional time to work with our partner agencies to ensure this type of requirement wouldn't hinder their business processes. So, in the meantime, we're going to encourage, to the extent practicable, that agencies include the RIN on their regulatory dockets.
Great. Thank you, Kristen. Our next question is about our next webinar. I know we've addressed that a little bit, but do you want to talk on that?
Our next webinar is planned for the spring of this year, and we will be discussing, in that webinar, we'll actually discuss lessons learned in early public engagement, something that many of the federal agencies have been exploring.
Great. Thanks, Brian. Another question is, do other regulatory information sites use the RIN, such as Federal Register or reginfo.gov?
Reginfo.gov, definitely. A lot of times that's the first place where you're going to find the RIN that's associated with a regulatory action. The actual Federal Register document often contains the RIN. I mean, there's a place for it. We just need to encourage agencies to include it. But the key item here is that it is found in these different places, and that's the one Bryant was saying before, the kind of unique tracker that we can use to kind of tie the information from all these different systems together and ensure kind of consistency between the information that you find throughout all the sites.
Thank you. And I think our next question talks a lot about consistency here. So let's take this one that came in via instant messaging. Is it possible that some documents will be related to multiple dockets and therefore have multiple RINs? Or is it the case that some documents will exist in duplicate and separate dockets on regs.gov? If the latter is the case, how would these documents show up in a search?
If I understand this correctly, what's being asked here is whether documents will have multiple RINs associated with them. And the answer to that question is yes. While documents will have multiple RINs associated with them, a docket, on the other hand, will only have one RIN associated with it, so that we can maintain this consistent use and predictability for searching for specific regulatory actions, so that there is a one-to-one relationship. Again, going back to the very good question that we received from the law librarian, who's one of the law librarians who's actually attending the webinar right now. Again, going back to that, the ISBN, it refers directly to a book. And in this case, if we're able to, according to the best practices, help agencies create this sense of, this standardization of that regulatory information to only use it based on a one-to-one relationship, we can make sure that one can actually come to the site and directly, by entering that ISBN, entering the RIN, they can actually get directly to the rulemaking, the regulatory action that they were looking for. I hope I've answered your question.
Thanks, Brian. And we have one last question here about the online discussion. How long is the online discussion on regulations.gov exchange going to be open?
We're going to have the best practices exchange online discussion open for at least 2 months. If not longer, we'll see. But definitely at least 2 months through March.
Great. Thank you. Well, this concludes our question and answer period for today's webinar. We would like to thank everyone for their participation today. The following materials will be posted to the regulations.gov exchange site: a transcript of today's webinar, an audio recording of today's webinar, frequently asked questions, as well as information on future webinars. Thanks again, and enjoy the rest of your day.